The cafe was louder than it had any right to be at that hour. Chairs scraped against the floor, cups clinked, voices overlapped in a way that made the air feel heavy instead of lively. He stood just outside the entrance for a brief second, hand resting on the door handle, already regretting the decision to come in. It wasn't fear exactly, it was exhaustion, the kind that settles deep into the bones after years of carrying responsibility without complaint. He was a Black American single father, raising a 6-year-old daughter on his own, and life had taught him to avoid places that invited stares, assumptions, or questions he didn't have the energy to answer. All he wanted was coffee, 5 quiet minutes, a small pocket of normalcy. But moments like that rarely announced themselves. As the door swung open and noise spilled out toward him, he didn't yet know that this ordinary decision, stepping inside instead of turning away, would become the first line in a story that would challenge everything he believed about connection, judgment, and the quiet power of being seen. If you've ever walked into a place already tired, already carrying more than people can see, this moment might feel familiar. The kind where you tell yourself, just get through it, because stopping to feel would slow you down too much. That was where he was mentally, operating on habit, not hope. His daughter stood beside him, small hand wrapped tightly around his fingers, trusting him in the effortless way children do. He felt the weight of that trust every single day. And before the story moves any further, pause for a second. Wherever you're watching this from, your room, your car, your phone on a break, let us know in the comments. What country or city are you watching from right now? Stories like this stretch far beyond one place, and knowing where you're listening from reminds us that these moments connect more lives than we realize. Because this isn't just his story. It's about those quiet crossroads we all reach, when we don't know yet that something meaningful is waiting on the other side of a simple choice. Inside the cafe, his senses were immediately overwhelmed. The smell of coffee mixed with baked pastries, but instead of comfort, it brought a sharp reminder of how long it had been since he'd slowed down enough to enjoy small pleasures. He guided his daughter through the crowd with practiced awareness, instinctively choosing paths wide enough for her steps, even though he didn't consciously think about why he did it that way. Being a parent had rewired him. He noticed exits, obstacles, people's moods. He noticed everything except himself. They had barely taken a few steps inside when he saw her. Near the entrance, struggling, not loudly, not dramatically, but visibly, a white woman in a wheelchair, trying to manage the heavy door as people passed by her without breaking stride. Some glanced at her and looked away. Others pretended not to notice at all. It was subtle, but unmistakable. He felt the familiar internal conflict rise. He wanted to help. He always did. But wanting to help and acting on it weren't the same anymore. Experience had taught him that good intentions were often misread, and misunderstandings came with consequences he didn't have the time or emotional space to deal with. He hesitated, and that hesitation carried history. Moments where kindness had been questioned, where silence felt safer than engagement, where stepping forward came with explanations no one asked for, but somehow expected. He told himself someone else would help, someone with fewer complications attached to their presence. That was when his daughter tugged gently at his sleeve and looked up at him with eyes that hadn't yet learned to calculate risk the way adults do. Her voice was soft, not accusatory, just curious. She asked why no one was helping her. Not loudly, not to shame anyone. Just a question, simple and devastating in its innocence. It landed harder than any judgment ever had, because there was no defensiveness in it, no fear, just truth. And in that moment, he realized something uncomfortable. He had been teaching his daughter resilience, responsibility, empathy, but without meaning to, he was also teaching her avoidance. The world didn't need another lesson in looking away. He moved before he could overthink it. Stepping forward, he held the door open, steady and quiet, making the action feel as normal as breathing. The woman looked up, clearly surprised, and for a split second, the noise of the cafe seemed to fade. She smiled, not the polite kind reserved for strangers, but a real one that reached her eyes. She thanked him, simply, without drama. He nodded, just as simply, and followed behind as she rolled further inside. He helped guide her toward a table near the window, where sunlight softened the space and made it feel less crowded. As she settled in, she looked at him again, this time more carefully, as if reading him beyond the surface. Then she said something quietly, honestly, without apology or expectation. She said she was sorry she was in a wheelchair. The words hung between them, heavy with everything society had taught her to carry. He didn't respond immediately. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted what he said next to matter. And without realizing it yet, that pause, filled with intention instead of discomfort, marked the true beginning of a connection that would ripple far beyond that cafe door. What happened next didn't look dramatic to anyone watching from the outside. No raised voices, no sudden movement, just a quiet pause that stretched a second longer than expected. But inside that pause lived 1,000 learned responses, all competing to come out at once. When the woman apologized for being in a wheelchair, the room didn't actually freeze, but it felt like it did. The kind of stillness that happens when people subconsciously lean away, unsure of what the right response is supposed to be. He had seen it before, heard the awkward reassurances, the rushed denials, the uncomfortable silence that followed. He could have chosen any of those paths. Instead, he chose honesty. He smiled, not performative, not forced, and told her she didn't need to apologize. He said it simply, calmly, as if she'd apologized for the weather. Then he added something unexpected. He said he and his daughter were just glad she was there. That was it. No lecture, no virtue signaling, just inclusion, spoken plainly. And in that moment, something invisible shifted, not in the cafe, but in her. She blinked once, like she hadn't prepared for that answer. People prepared for pity. They prepared for discomfort. They prepared for distance. They rarely prepared for acceptance that didn't ask for anything in return. His daughter climbed onto the chair beside him before either adult could say anything else, her movements casual and unguarded. She waved at the woman with the confidence of someone who had never been taught to be afraid of difference. She introduced herself proudly, announced her name, and immediately offered information no one had asked for, that her dad made the best pancakes in the world. It was said with such conviction that it broke the tension completely. The woman laughed, not the restrained kind, but the surprised kind that escapes before it can be filtered. She introduced herself too, her voice lighter now, as if a weight had been quietly set down. She joked about needing proof of the pancake claim. And just like that, the conversation stopped being about what separated them and became about what connected them. He stood up without ceremony and told them to stay right there. When he returned carrying 3 plates instead of 2, confusion crossed her face. She pointed out that she hadn't ordered anything. He told her he had. For her, she hesitated, instinctively moving toward refusal, conditioned by years of being made to feel like an inconvenience. She said he didn't have to. He replied that he wanted to. No justification, no explanation. That distinction mattered more than either of them realized at the time. Wanting to include someone was different from feeling obligated to help them. As they ate together, conversation unfolded naturally. She spoke about how people often talked around her instead of to her, how dates turned into interviews about limitations instead of interests, how the word sorry followed her into rooms long before she ever spoke. He listened without interrupting. His daughter listened too, her expression serious in the way only children get when they sense something important is being shared. Then his daughter asked a question that no adult would have dared to ask. She wanted to know if the wheelchair ever got tired. The woman laughed again, explaining that sometimes it did, especially uphill. His daughter nodded thoughtfully and responded that it was okay because her dad got tired too. The words landed quietly but powerfully. He felt his throat tighten, caught off guard by the truth wrapped inside that innocent observation. For the first time since they'd met, the woman looked at him differently, not as a helper, not as a stranger, but as someone who understood fatigue on a deeper level. She told him that most people helped for a moment and then disappeared. He met her gaze and said they weren't in a hurry. And for the first time in a long while, he realized that staying, really staying, might matter more than any grand gesture ever could. By the time they finished eating, the cafe had begun to empty. Chairs were stacked, conversations thinned, but something between them had filled the space in a way noise never could. She spoke about the accident then, not seeking sympathy, just offering context. One rainy night, one distracted driver, one moment that split life into before and after. She said she didn't lose her life, only had to learn a new way to live it. His daughter listened like every word mattered, because to her, it did. When his phone buzzed with a message from daycare, reality nudged its way back in. Running late again. He sighed, the familiar weight settling back onto his shoulders. The woman noticed and asked if he was a single dad. When he told her his wife had passed 3 years earlier, her expression softened, not with pity, but respect. She said it explained his patience. And in that shared silence, something unspoken formed, a recognition that pain didn't always divide people. Sometimes, it quietly aligned them. The park had always been part of Marcus's routine, though he'd never thought much about why. It was quiet in the afternoons, predictable in its layout, and safe in ways he didn't question anymore. Smooth paths, wide benches, open sightlines. He chose it instinctively, the same way someone reaches for a light switch in a dark room without thinking. That afternoon, Emma ran a few steps ahead, her laughter echoing softly between the trees, while Marcus walked beside Sarah, matching her pace without making a show of it. The air was cooler than the cafe, the kind of calm that settles nerves instead of stimulating them. Sarah noticed things most people didn't. She noticed how Marcus subtly adjusted their route, how he avoided uneven ground, how his eyes scanned ahead before Emma ever reached a turn. She mentioned it gently, not accusingly, just observe it. He admitted that after years of navigating the world for two people instead of one, you learned to plan without realizing you were planning. Sarah smiled and said most people didn't. And in that small exchange, something important happened. She wasn't thanking him. She was recognizing him. They sat on a bench while Emma collected leaves nearby, holding each one up like a treasure she'd discovered all on her own. Sarah watched her with a softness that felt earned, not assumed. After a moment, she asked Marcus if she could be honest. He told her she could. She confessed that she'd almost canceled on coming to the park that day, not because of him or Emma, but because of the looks. The explanation. The way strangers decided who she was before she ever opened her mouth. She spoke calmly, without bitterness, but Marcus could hear the fatigue underneath. He didn't interrupt. He wasn't reassured. He just listened, giving her something she hadn't asked for, but clearly needed: space to exist without defense. Emma suddenly ran back and handed Sarah a leaf, proudly announcing that it was strong because it didn't tear. Sarah accepted it carefully, holding it as if it carried meaning beyond its shape. And it did. It was a gift offered without hesitation, without calculation, without seeing a wheelchair first. A man walking his dog slowed as he passed, his stare lingering just a moment too long. Marcus noticed Sarah's shoulders tense, the shift subtle but unmistakable. Without thinking, he moved his chair closer to hers. Not protective, not confrontational, just present. It wasn't about shielding her from the world. It was about refusing to let the world isolate her. Sarah exhaled quietly and thanked him, her voice steady but sincere. That word, thank you, didn't feel transactional this time. It felt mutual. Emma returned again, full of energy, and asked the question that neither adult had been brave enough to voice. She wanted to know if Sarah could come to dinner sometime. There was no build-up, no explanation, just an invitation, pure and uncomplicated. Marcus froze for half a second, aware of the unspoken rules parents were expected to enforce. This wasn't one of those times. He looked at Sarah. Sarah looked back, uncertainty flickering across her face. He nodded. He said his daughter was right. Everyone should get invited. Dinner changed everything, though none of them understood that yet. It wasn't fancy, just a small table, mismatched plates, Emma chattering about school while Marcus cooked pancakes out of habit rather than occasion. Sarah noticed the way the apartment felt lived in, not chaotic, but layered with resilience. Photos on the wall told a story without words. Emma moved freely, comfortable in her space, secure in her world. Sarah wasn't treated like a guest who needed accommodating or apologizing for space. She was simply there. They talked about small things at first: music, favorite foods, bad movies that were secretly good. And somewhere between laughter and shared silence, Marcus realized how long it had been since someone sat across from him without expectations. No assumptions, no judgments. Just presence, the kind that didn't demand more than he could give. Later, after Emma had fallen asleep, Sarah thanked Marcus again, this time for the evening, for the ease of it, for not making her feel like a lesson or a project. Marcus admitted that he'd been afraid too, afraid of getting it wrong, of saying the wrong thing, of making a moment heavier than it needed to be. Sarah smiled and told him that what mattered wasn't perfection, but intention. They stood there for a moment, the apartment quiet around them, both aware that something had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to matter. As Sarah prepared to leave, Marcus felt an unfamiliar sensation settle in his chest. Not fear, not relief. Hope, tentative, cautious, but real. And as the door closed behind her, he understood something he hadn't allowed himself to believe in a long time. Some connections didn't ask you to be ready. They asked you to be open. The days after dinner passed quietly, but for Marcus, something had changed beneath the surface. Life resumed its usual rhythm. Early mornings, school drop-offs, work deadlines, bedtime routines. But now there was a new awareness woven into it all. He found himself replaying small moments from that evening without meaning to. Sarah's laugh when Emma exaggerated a story. The way she'd listened without rushing to respond. The ease of conversation that hadn't asked him to perform or explain himself. It unsettled him, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it was unfamiliar. He had grown used to emotional efficiency, doing what needed to be done, saying what was necessary, keeping things moving. But that dinner had slowed time in a way he hadn't anticipated. It reminded him that connection didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it slipped in quietly, through open doors and unguarded moments, and stayed longer than expected. Sarah felt it too, though her experience carried different weight. She had replayed the invitation over and over, not the dinner itself, but the fact that it had happened so naturally. No long explanations. No reassurances offered out of obligation. Just an assumption of belonging she hadn't realized how deeply she'd missed. In her world, invitations were often conditional, carefully phrased, sometimes rescinded, often loaded with unspoken questions. But with Marcus and Emma, there had been none of that. She'd been included first, understood later. That order mattered. It shifted something fundamental inside her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she had to prove she was worth someone's time. She simply was. And that realization followed her through the days that came after, settling gently but firmly in her chest. Their next meeting wasn't planned far in advance. It happened the way most meaningful moments do, casually, almost accidentally. Marcus texted Sarah about a community event at the park, mentioning that Emma had been asking about her. Sarah hesitated before replying, old instincts rising to the surface. Public spaces still carried risk. Stares, whispers, the quiet math of deciding whether the effort would be worth the emotional cost. But then she thought about Emma's certainty, about Marcus's calm presence. She said yes. When they met again, it felt less like a first meeting and more like a continuation. Emma greeted Sarah like someone returning home. Marcus noticed the ease with which Sarah navigated the space, the confidence that seemed to grow each time she didn't have to explain herself. They talked more openly this time, about work, about dreams that had been paused, not abandoned, about how life rarely followed the scripts people expected. Not everyone reacted kindly. Marcus noticed the glances again, the subtle shifts in body language when people registered Sarah's wheelchair beside him. He noticed how quickly assumptions formed, how easily strangers felt entitled to context they hadn't earned. But something in him had changed since that first day at the cafe. The fear of being misunderstood no longer outweighed the importance of being present. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't explain. He simply stayed. That quiet refusal to shrink spoke louder than any defense ever could. Sarah noticed too. She noticed how Marcus didn't rush conversations when others lingered nearby, how he didn't pull away or overcompensate. His steadiness created a kind of emotional shelter, not by blocking the world out, but by refusing to let it dictate their experience. Emma, as always, moved through everything with uncomplicated clarity. She asked questions when she had them. She invited without hesitation. She treated Sarah as someone who belonged, because to her, belonging wasn't something you earned, it was something you offered. Watching her daughter-like trust reshape adult spaces stirred something deep in Marcus. It reminded him that the rules he'd learned about caution and self-protection were taught, not inherent. That maybe the world could be navigated differently, if one was willing to risk softness. Sarah saw it too. She saw how Marcus was learning alongside his daughter, how he was unlearning assumptions he hadn't realized he carried. And for the first time since her accident, she felt like she wasn't being absorbed into someone else's life as an exception, but woven into it as herself. As the afternoon faded and they prepared to part ways again, none of them said anything about the future. They didn't label what was happening. They didn't make promises or plans beyond the next small meeting. But as Sarah rolled away and Marcus watched Emma wave enthusiastically, a quiet certainty settled between them. This wasn't a temporary kindness. It wasn't a feel-good moment destined to fade. It was the beginning of a pattern, of choosing presence over comfort, inclusion over fear. And though neither of them would have said it out loud just yet, they both sensed it. Some connections, once formed, ask more of you than politeness. They ask you to grow. Marcus hadn't expected fear to show up the way it did. It wasn't loud or panicked. It crept in quietly, disguised as responsibility. As his connection with Sarah deepened, so did the questions he tried not to ask himself. How would this affect Emma? What would people assume? What complications would follow something that already felt fragile? He told himself he was being practical. That caution was part of being a good father. But late at night, when the apartment was still and the world stopped demanding answers, he recognized the truth beneath it all. He was afraid of wanting something again. Afraid of opening a door he had sealed shut after loss taught him how much it hurt when doors closed unexpectedly. Loving once had cost him everything. Loving again felt like tempting fate. And yet, the thought of pulling away from Sarah felt heavier than the thought of stepping forward. Sarah carried her own quiet battle. Each positive moment with Marcus and Emma brought with it a familiar tension, the waiting for the other shoe to drop. She had learned to brace herself for disappointment, not because people were cruel, but because they were inconsistent. Interest faded, invitations thinned, silence replaced warmth. It had happened often enough that she trusted the pattern more than the exception. But Marcus wasn't following the pattern. He didn't disappear when things became complicated. He didn't rush intimacy or retreat from vulnerability. That unsettled her in ways she didn't fully know how to articulate. She found herself wondering when the moment would come where she would be asked to make things easier for him by making herself smaller. The fact that it hadn't happened yet felt both hopeful and terrifying. The turning point came during a conversation neither of them had planned. They were sitting together while Emma played nearby, the evening calm and unhurried. Sarah mentioned an opportunity she'd been offered, a position that would require her to travel occasionally, speak publicly, and be visible in ways she hadn't been in years. She spoke carefully, as if gauging Marcus's reaction before allowing herself to fully believe in the possibility. He listened, truly listened, and then told her he thought she should take it. No hesitation, no concern for inconvenience, no subtle shift in tone, just support. Sarah was stunned. She had grown used to weighing her dreams against other people's comfort. Hearing someone prioritize her growth without qualification caught her off guard. It was the first time she realized Marcus didn't see her as a complication to manage, but as a person whose aspirations mattered. Emma, sensing the weight of the moment without understanding its details, asked if Sarah would still come to the park if she traveled. Sarah smiled and promised she would. Marcus watched the exchange with a swelling sense of pride, not just in his daughter's openness, but in his own capacity to adapt. He had built his life around structure because structure felt safe. But Sarah's presence was teaching him that flexibility didn't equal instability. That growth didn't mean chaos. It meant expansion. The realization softened something in him that had been rigid for too long. He began to imagine a future that wasn't defined by fear of loss, but by resilience in the face of uncertainty. Still, doubt lingered. It surfaced in small ways. A pause before answering messages. A hesitation before making plans too far ahead. Sarah noticed these moments, not with accusation, but with awareness. One evening, she named it gently. She asked Marcus if he was afraid of what people would say. He didn't deny it. He admitted that being seen, truly seen, had consequences, especially for someone who had spent years learning how to disappear into responsibility. Sarah nodded, understanding more than he realized. She told him that visibility had cost her too, that stepping into the world as she was meant accepting both connection and judgment. The difference now was choice. She wasn't asking him to be fearless. She was asking him to be honest. That honesty became their anchor. They didn't rush toward labels or declarations. Instead, they spoke openly about boundaries, about fears, about the ways they'd both been shaped by experiences they hadn't chosen. Emma continued to be the quiet constant, grounding their conversations in reality with her unfiltered presence. Through her, Marcus and Sarah saw what mattered most, not perfection, not certainty, but intention. By the end of that week, something between them had solidified. Not a promise of forever, but a shared understanding. Whatever this was becoming, it deserved care, courage, and patience. And for the first time in a long while, both of them felt ready to offer all three. The first real test didn't come in the form of an argument or a dramatic turning point. It came quietly, wrapped in other people's opinions. Marcus felt at the moment he walked into the school courtyard with Emma and Sarah beside him. Conversations paused just a second too long. Smiles arrived late, or not at all. A few parents glanced from Sarah's wheelchair to Marcus and back again, curiosity thinly disguised as concern. No one said anything outright, but the atmosphere shifted enough to be felt. Marcus had known this day would come. Being private had protected him for years. Being visible invited interpretation. He caught himself straightening his posture, not out of pride, but preparation. Sarah noticed, too. She'd lived inside that tension long enough to recognize its shape. She kept her expression calm, her body language open, refusing to apologize for existing in a space she had every right to occupy. Emma, unaware of the undercurrent, greeted her friends with excitement, pulling Sarah into conversations as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Marcus watched how easily his daughter bridged gaps adults struggled to cross. A teacher approached, polite but cautious, asking Sarah questions that skirted the line between interest and assumption. Marcus felt a familiar heat rise in his chest. Before he could speak, Sarah answered confidently, redirecting the conversation back to Emma. She didn't shrink. She didn't over-explain. She simply existed as herself. That quiet strength did something to Marcus. It reminded him that protection didn't always mean stepping in. Sometimes it meant standing beside someone and trusting their voice. The whispers came later, not directly to them, but close enough to hear. Questions about whether this situation was confusing for Emma. Speculation about how complicated Marcus's life already was. Marcus felt the old instinct flare, the urge to withdraw, to simplify by stepping back. He looked at Emma laughing with a friend, at Sarah listening patiently, fully present. The choice became clear. He reached for Sarah's hand without thinking, a small gesture that spoke volumes. Not defiant, not performative, just honest. Sarah looked up, surprised for only a moment before she squeezed back. In that exchange, something shifted. The world hadn't changed. The stares didn't disappear, but their response to them did. Later that day, Marcus received a message from a family member, well-intentioned but heavy with implication. Advice disguised as concern. Warnings about making life harder than it needed to be. Marcus read it twice before setting the phone down. He didn't feel angry. He felt tired. But beneath the fatigue was clarity. For years, he'd shaped his life around avoiding judgment, around doing what was expected so no one would question his choices. Sarah hadn't asked him to challenge that. She'd simply existed in a way that made him question whether he wanted to keep living that way. That night, after Emma was asleep, Marcus shared the message with Sarah. He didn't ask her to fix it. He didn't ask her to reassure him. He just told her how it made him feel. Sarah listened, her expression thoughtful. When she spoke, she didn't minimize his fear or dismiss the reality of scrutiny. She told him that being with her meant being seen differently, and she understood if that was too much. But she also told him something he hadn't expected, that she didn't want to be chosen out of bravery alone. She wanted to be chosen out of truth. Marcus sat with that for a long time. Truth, he realized, wasn't always comfortable, but it was steadier than fear. It asked less of him in the long run. It allowed him to show up as he was, not as who he thought he needed to be. The next morning, Marcus walked Emma to school alone. Sarah had a meeting across town. The absence felt noticeable, not because something was missing, but because something had been added to his life that now mattered. When Emma asked if Sarah would join them later, Marcus smiled and said yes. And in that simple answer, he felt the weight of his decision settle, not as a burden, but as commitment. He wasn't choosing a path free of difficulty. He was choosing one aligned with who he was becoming. And for the first time since his loss, Marcus understood that protecting his daughter didn't mean shielding her from complexity. It meant modeling integrity, courage, and love that didn't retreat when challenged. Change rarely announces itself all at once. For Marcus, it arrived in small moments that slowly rearranged his sense of normal. Sarah became part of their routine, not as an add-on, but as a presence that fit naturally into the spaces they already occupied. Emma talked about her casually at school, mentioned her in conversations the way children mention things that feel permanent. Marcus noticed how easily Sarah navigated his life, not by reshaping it, but by understanding its rhythms. She showed up when she said she would. She listened without trying to fix things. She respected the quiet that sometimes settled over Marcus when memories surfaced unexpectedly. That kind of consistency did something profound. It made him trust not just Sarah, but himself again. Trust that he could open up without losing the structure he had worked so hard to build. Sarah, in turn, found herself changing in ways she hadn't anticipated. Being with Marcus and Emma didn't make her forget the limitations she lived with, but it reframed them. She wasn't constantly calculating whether she was welcome. She wasn't bracing for withdrawal. Instead, she found herself imagining future moments without immediately filtering them through doubt. It felt unfamiliar, almost indulgent. She caught herself smiling at small plans, a weekend outing, a shared meal, a school event, and then stopping, waiting for the fear to follow. Often, it didn't. And when it did, she voiced it instead of swallowing it. Marcus met that honesty with his own. Their conversations deepened, not through grand declarations, but through consistent truth. It wasn't passion that bound them. It was trust. The turning point came during a school event meant to celebrate families. Marcus had debated attending with Sarah. He knew the looks would return, the questions, the assumptions. Emma, however, made the decision simple. She asked if Sarah was coming as if the answer were obvious. Marcus didn't hesitate this time. At the event, he stood beside Sarah openly, introducing her without explanation. Not as a symbol, not as a statement, just as someone important in their lives. A few people responded warmly. Others didn't. But Marcus noticed something different in himself. He wasn't scanning the room for approval anymore. He was grounded, present. When Emma reached for both of them, taking each of their hands, the moment felt complete. Not perfect, but whole. Later that evening, after the noise had faded and Emma was asleep, Marcus and Sarah sat together in the quiet. Sarah admitted she had been afraid to hope for something lasting. Marcus admitted he had been afraid of failing again. They didn't promise forever. They didn't need to. What mattered was the clarity between them. They wanted to choose each other, not in spite of difficulty, but with awareness of it. That choice felt stronger than any idealized version of love either of them had imagined. It wasn't built on fantasy. It was built on presence, respect, and shared responsibility. Emma sensed the shift long before either adult named it. She started including Sarah in drawings, in future plans, in casual statements about when. When Sarah noticed and gently questioned it, Marcus smiled and told her that Emma trusted her heart. And in many ways, so did he. That trust carried weight. It asked them to be steady, to be honest, to be willing to grow together. They accepted that responsibility without ceremony, understanding that love, at its healthiest, was less about intensity and more about intention. As night settled in and the house grew quiet, Marcus looked at Sarah and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not certainty, but peace. The kind that comes from aligning action with values. Sarah felt it too. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them openly, not as a statement to the world, but as a family learning how to define itself. And as they sat there, neither of them said what both were thinking, that the story they had stepped into together wasn't ending. It was just finding its shape. The realization came to Marcus on an ordinary morning, the kind that would have passed unnoticed not long ago. Emma was at the table, focused on her homework, humming softly as sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor. Sarah sat nearby, reading through notes for an upcoming engagement, occasionally looking up to offer help or ask a question. Nothing remarkable was happening, and that was precisely the point. Life hadn't become easier or simpler, but it had become fuller. The chaos that once felt overwhelming now carried warmth. Marcus understood then that love didn't always arrive as a dramatic shift. Sometimes it revealed itself through consistency, the quiet certainty of shared space, the absence of fear in moments that once felt fragile. This wasn't the life he had planned. It was the life that had grown naturally from choosing presence over avoidance. Sarah felt the weight of that morning too, though she experienced it differently. For years, she had lived with the sense that her life existed on the margins of other people's stories, that she was someone to be accommodated, not integrated. But here, she wasn't adapting herself to fit. She belonged without negotiation. The home didn't feel borrowed. It felt shared. She watched Marcus move through the kitchen with ease, saw Emma glance at her instinctively when she had a question, and realized how profoundly trust had changed her. Not because it erased uncertainty, but because it made room for it without fear. She didn't know what the future would demand of her body, her career, or her heart. But for the first time, she believed she wouldn't have to face it alone. The outside world didn't transform just because their lives had. Judgment still existed. Curiosity still lingered. But Marcus no longer measured his worth by other people's understanding. He had learned that being a good father wasn't about protecting Emma from complexity. It was about showing her how to navigate it with integrity. Emma was growing up watching love practiced deliberately. Not loudly, not perfectly, but honestly. That lesson would shape her long after the details of this chapter faded. And Marcus knew it. The fear that once guided his choices had loosened its grip, replaced by something steadier. Purpose. He wasn't reacting anymore. He was choosing. One evening, as they prepared for dinner, Emma asked a question that lingered in the room. She wanted to know if families always looked the same. Marcus paused, aware of the significance wrapped inside her curiosity. Sarah waited quietly, allowing him space to answer in his own way. Marcus told Emma that families didn't all look the same, but they all shared one thing: They chose each other. Emma seemed satisfied with that answer. She nodded and went back to setting the table, as if the matter were settled. In that moment, Marcus felt a swell of gratitude for the journey that had brought them there. Not because it had been easy, but because it had been intentional. As night fell, Marcus and Sarah sat together, reflecting on how a simple moment in a crowded cafe had led them here. Neither of them would have predicted it. Neither of them had been looking for it. But sometimes, life didn't wait for readiness. It responded to openness, to small decisions made with care, to kindness offered without expectation. Their story hadn't begun with certainty. It began with a door held open, a question asked without fear, a choice to stay when walking away would have been easier. And maybe that was the quiet truth this story carried. That the moments we dismiss as ordinary often shape us the most. That inclusion changes lives, not through grand gestures, but through consistency. That love, when practiced with patience and courage, has a way of redefining family itself. The chapter closed without a dramatic ending, because real life rarely offered one. But somewhere beyond the frame of this story, three people continued forward together, changed, connected, and willing to keep choosing one another. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments what stood out to you the most. And wherever you're watching from, remember, sometimes the smallest choices open the biggest doors.